Elijah Brennan had been riding through the Wyoming blizzard for 11 hours straight. His fingers frozen so stiff inside his torn gloves that he could no longer feel the reins. His lips cracked and bleeding, his horse stumbling beneath him with every step. And when he finally saw the collapsed figure half buried in the snow beside the frozen creek, he knew with terrible certainty that saving her would cost him everything he had left in this world, which was almost nothing at all. The widow lay face down in a drift, her dark hair spread across the white like spilled ink, one arm reaching forward as if she had been crawling toward something only she could see. And Elijah slid from his saddle and fell to his knees beside her, his own body shaking so violently that he could barely pull her from the snow. She was still breathing, barely, her lips blue and her skin like ice. And when he lifted her, she weighed nothing, as if the cold had already begun stealing her substance, turning her into a ghost before she was even dead. He had no shelter, no fire, nothing but the clothes on his back, and a horse that might not survive another hour in this storm. And as he held the freezing widow against his chest and felt her dying heartbeat flutter like a trapped bird, Elijah Brennan understood that the cruelty of the West was not in its storms or its distances, but in the choices it forced upon broken men, in the way it made you decide between your own survival and someone else's life, between walking away and becoming the kind of man you swore you would never be. If stories of desperate choices in the frozen heart of the frontier speak to something deep in your soul, subscribe now, because what happens next will show you exactly how cruel the West could be to those who dared to choose compassion over survival. The widow's name was Catherine Marsh. Though Elijah would not learn this until much later, would not know that she had been walking for 2 days since her wagon broke an axle 15 miles back, would not know that her husband had died 3 weeks earlier from pneumonia, and that she had been trying to reach her sister's homestead near Cheyenne when the November storm caught her in the open. All he knew in that moment was that she was dying, and that he had perhaps 30 minutes to save her before the cold finished what it had started. It was the night of November 18th, 1882, and the blizzard that had swept down from the Bighorn Mountains was the worst Wyoming had seen in a decade, the kind of storm that killed livestock and froze entire herds where they stood, that buried homesteads and turned trails into death traps. Elijah himself had been caught in the open while riding from a failed job at a ranch near Buffalo, had been turned away because the rancher said he looked too hungry to be useful, too broke to be trusted. And now here he was with a dying woman in his arms and a choice that would define him. He pulled her onto his horse, feeling the animal shudder beneath the added weight, and began searching desperately for any kind of shelter. The snow fell so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead, the wind howling across the frozen creek with a sound like wolves crying, and his own body was shutting down, his thoughts growing slow and confused, his movements clumsy. Then he saw it, a dark shape against the white, a small line shack that some rancher had built years ago for his hands during roundup season. Elijah urged his horse forward, half carrying, half dragging the freezing widow, and when they reached the shack, he kicked the door open and pulled her inside. The interior was a single room, bare walls and a dirt floor, but it had a roof and walls and that was more than they had outside. He laid Catherine on the floor and went back for his horse, leading the animal inside as well, because leaving it outside meant certain death. And once they were all inside, he barred the door against the storm and stood there shaking, trying to think through the fog in his brain. The freezing widow was not breathing right, her chest barely moving, her skin gone from blue to gray, and Elijah knew she was minutes from death. He had no wood for a fire, no matches even if he did, and the temperature inside the shack was barely warmer than outside. The only heat available was body heat, and that meant a choice that would have been scandalous in any other circumstance, that would have been unthinkable to a man raised with even a shred of propriety. But propriety was a luxury for people who were not freezing to death, and Elijah Brennan had learned long ago that survival required you to abandon the rules of civilization. He stripped off his wet coat and her wet dress, his fingers so numb he could barely work the buttons, and then he pulled her against him, wrapping his coat around both of them, pressing his body against hers to share what little warmth he still possessed. They lay like that for hours, Elijah holding the freezing widow while the storm raged outside and his horse stood over them both, the animal's breath creating small clouds in the frozen air. Slowly, impossibly, Catherine began to warm, her breathing deepening, her skin losing some of its deathly pallor, and Elijah felt a fierce pride in this small victory against the cold. But victory came with consequences he had not yet imagined, consequences that would reveal the true cruelty of the West. Because when the storm finally broke just before dawn, when the first gray light filtered through the cracks in the shack walls, Elijah heard voices outside, heard men calling to each other, and he realized they had taken shelter on land belonging to one of the big ranchers, a man named Caldwell, who owned 30,000 acres and ruled them like a king. The door burst open and 3 cowboys stood there, their faces hard with suspicion and something worse, something hungry and mean. They saw Elijah and the widow lying together, saw their state of undress, and their expressions changed from suspicion to certainty, from certainty to righteous anger. The oldest one, a man with a gray beard and a rifle, said, "Well now, what do we have here?" And his voice carried the weight of judgment already past. Elijah tried to explain, tried to tell them about finding Catherine freezing in the snow, about having no choice but to save her this way, but the cowboys were not interested in explanations. They saw what they wanted to see, what the cruel West had taught them to see. A broke cowboy taking advantage of a helpless widow, a man without honor or decency, a drifter who needed to be taught a lesson. They dragged Elijah outside into the new fallen snow, and the beating they gave him was methodical and brutal, the kind of violence that men perform when they believe they are enforcing justice. They broke his ribs and his nose, split his lip and blackened both eyes, and when he tried to fight back, they held him down and kept hitting until he could no longer stand. Catherine tried to stop them, screaming that he had saved her life, that he was innocent, but they dismissed her words as the confused gratitude of a woman who did not understand what had really happened, who could not see the truth of her own violation. And that was the deepest cruelty, that the freezing widow he had saved would not be believed, that her testimony carried no weight against the assumptions of men who had already decided what kind of story this was. When the cowboys finally stopped, when they had satisfied their need for righteous violence, they told Elijah to get off Caldwell land and never come back. Told him he was lucky they did not hang him right there for what he had done. They took his horse as payment for using the shack without permission, took his saddle and his few possessions, left him with nothing but his broken body and the clothes on his back. Catherine begged them to listen, pleaded with them to understand, but they loaded her onto one of their horses and rode toward the main ranch house, leaving Elijah alone in the snow with blood freezing on his face and the knowledge that the West had punished him for his compassion, had taken everything he had left because he chose to save a life instead of protecting himself. Pause here and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Elijah's place? Would you have stopped for the freezing widow knowing what it might cost you? Or would you have ridden past and saved yourself? When the price of doing right is everything you have, is it still right? Elijah spent 3 days walking toward the nearest town, his broken ribs making every breath an agony, his face so swollen he could barely see. He had no food, no water, except what he could scoop from frozen streams, and twice he considered simply lying down in the snow and letting the cold take him. But something in him refused to quit, some stubborn core that would not accept that this was how his story ended, beaten and broken for the crime of saving a freezing widow. When he finally reached the small settlement of KC, more dead than alive, the first person he saw was Catherine Marsh, standing outside the general store with a basket on her arm and a look of horror on her face when she recognized him. She ran to him, caught him as he collapsed, and for the first time since the beating, Elijah heard someone speak the truth of what had happened. Catherine had spent the past 3 days telling anyone who would listen about the cowboy who saved her life, about how he had given up his own warmth and safety to keep her from freezing, about how the men who beat him had been wrong, cruelly wrong. But in the small towns of Wyoming Territory in 1882, a widow's word carried little weight, especially when it contradicted the story told by Caldwell's men, and most people dismissed her version as the confused memories of a woman who had nearly frozen to death. Still, a few believed her, a few saw the truth in her eyes and the desperation in her voice, and when Elijah collapsed in the street, it was these few who helped carry him to the doctor's office. The doctor, an old man named Peterson who had seen every kind of frontier cruelty, examined Elijah's injuries and shook his head. 3 broken ribs, a broken nose, severe frostbite on both hands and feet, and a concussion that had left him seeing double. It would be weeks before he could work again, months before he was fully healed, and in the meantime he had no money, no way to pay for his care or even feed himself. Catherine tried to help, tried to give him what little money she had, but she herself was nearly destitute, was living on the charity of her sister, who had barely enough to feed her own family. The cruel West had trapped them both, had punished them for choosing compassion, and left them with nothing but their shared understanding of how unjust the world could be. But the story of the freezing widow and the broke cowboy who saved her began to spread beyond KC, began to make its way through the small towns and ranches of Wyoming Territory. The tale grew in the telling, became a story about honor and cruelty, about a man who sacrificed everything to save a stranger and the way the West repaid him for his decency. Not everyone believed it. Not everyone cared. But enough people heard the truth in it that opinions began to shift. A rancher named McAllister, who had known Elijah years before and remembered him as honest and hardworking, rode into KC and offered him a job once he healed, offered to stake him to a horse and saddle so he could work again. A widow named Mrs. Chen, who ran a boarding house, offered Catherine a room and a job helping with the cooking and cleaning. Small kindnesses in a hard land, small mercies that acknowledged the cruelty of what had happened and tried to balance the scales. Elijah took months to recover, spent the winter of 1882 healing in Mrs. Chen's boarding house, sleeping in a small room under the eaves and trying to understand what had happened to him. The freezing widow he had saved visited him often, brought him soup and bread, sat with him while he stared out the window at the snow-covered streets and wondered if doing the right thing was ever worth the cost. Catherine told him that she had filed a complaint with the territorial marshal, had demanded that Caldwell's men be held accountable for the beating. But the marshal had been reluctant to act against one of the territory's most powerful ranchers. The cruel West protected its own, and broke cowboys had no standing against men with land and money. But in March of 1883, something unexpected happened. A new territorial judge arrived in Wyoming, a man named Harrison who had a reputation for fairness and a deep contempt for vigilante justice. Catherine brought her case before him, told the full story of how Elijah had saved her life and how he had been beaten for it. And Judge Harrison listened with a face that grew darker with every word. He summoned Caldwell's men to appear before him, questioned them about what they had seen and what they had done, and when they tried to justify their actions, he cut them off with a voice like iron. Beating a man for saving a woman's life, he said, was not justice but cruelty, was exactly the kind of lawlessness that made the West a dangerous place for decent people. He fined each of the 3 cowboys $100, ordered them to return Elijah's horse and saddle, and made it clear that any further violence would result in jail time. It was not everything, not nearly enough to balance what Elijah had lost, but it was something, a small acknowledgement that what had been done to him was wrong. The freezing widow cried when she heard the verdict, and Elijah felt something shift inside him, some small restoration of faith in the possibility of justice. The cowboys paid the fines, but they did not apologize, did not admit wrongdoing, and when they returned his horse, they threw the reins at his feet with expressions of pure contempt. The cruel West did not easily forgive those who challenged its assumptions, did not quickly forget when someone made it confront its own injustice. Elijah took the job with McAllister and spent the spring working cattle, rebuilding his strength and his stake. The broke cowboy who had saved a freezing widow became just another ranch hand, just another man trying to make a living in a hard country. But the story followed him, whispered in saloons and trading posts, told around campfires and in bunkhouses. Some versions made him a hero, a man who embodied the best of frontier values. Other versions made him a fool, a man who had sacrificed everything for a woman he did not know and gained nothing but pain for his trouble. Elijah did not care which version people believed. He knew the truth of what he had done and why he had done it, and that was enough. Catherine stayed in KC, built a life there with the help of Mrs. Chen and others who saw her strength and determination. She and Elijah remained friends, bonded by their shared experience of the West's cruelty and the small mercies that had helped them survive it. They did not speak often of that night in the line shack, of the choice he had made and the price he had paid, but it was always there between them, a shared understanding that sometimes doing right costs more than anyone should have to pay, and that the cruel West would punish you for your decency as quickly as it would punish you for your crimes. By the summer of 1883, Elijah had saved enough money to buy his own horse and saddle, to pay back the debts he owed for his care and feeding during the long winter. The freezing widow he had saved was working at the boarding house, saving her own money, planning her own future. They were both survivors, both people who had looked at the West's cruelty and refused to let it break them completely, who had learned that sometimes the hardest thing is not surviving the cold or the violence, but surviving the injustice, the knowledge that doing right does not guarantee you will be treated right in return. The story of that November night in 1882, of the broke cowboy who saved a freezing widow and the cruel price he paid for his compassion, became one of those tales that the West tells about itself when it is being honest, when it is not pretending to be all heroism and adventure. It was a story about the gap between what we believe should happen and what actually does, about how a hard land makes hard choices and rarely rewards those who choose mercy over survival. Elijah Brennan never regretted stopping for Catherine Marsh, never wished he had ridden past and saved himself the pain. But he also never forgot the beating, never forgot the way good men could commit cruelty while believing they were enforcing justice, never forgot that the West he loved could be as cruel as it was beautiful, as unjust as it was free. Years later, when Elijah was an old man running his own small ranch near the Powder River, people would sometimes ask him about that night, about whether he would do it again, knowing what it would cost. He always gave the same answer. A freezing widow needed help, and he had the power to give it, and that made the choice simple, even if the consequences were not. The cruel West had taught him many lessons, but the most important one was this: you cannot control how others will respond to your decency, cannot prevent them from punishing you for doing right, but you can control whether you become the kind of person who walks past someone dying in the snow. And that choice, he would say, that choice is the only one that truly belongs to you, the only one that defines who you are when everything else has been stripped away. The West was cruel to those who dared to show compassion, cruel to broke cowboys and freezing widows alike, but it could not make them cruel in return, could not force them to abandon the part of themselves that believed in helping others, even when it cost everything. And in the end, that was the only victory worth claiming, the only thing the cruel West could not take away, no matter how hard it tried. If this story of impossible choices and frontier cruelty moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more true tales of the American West. Drop a comment telling me whether you would have stopped for the freezing widow, and remember that the hardest choices are often the ones that matter most. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.